Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kavala Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. You look exquisite. They call it exquisite.
Well, I'm trying to look up to you, my friend.
Others say dapa.
Thank you, sir.
And where the audience is largely situated, they call it smart.
Thank you, sir. A warm welcome to you all our Facebook followers watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka and ask him some questions concerning the political situation in Africa. Today we'll be talking about a wide range of issues, but I will start in Ethiopia. So Shaka, the African Union just concluded one of its, annual get-togethers. Your thoughts on that?
I don't know that really it has been anything particularly unusual. And I have heard some people, somehow whispering that it is the Egyptian strongman who now happens to be the chairman of the African Union. I don't see why, that talk. I don't see why people are talking about that, because let's face it, what about the individual who actually handed him the baton?
It's interesting that the leadership or the chairmanship of the Africa Union seems to be rotating around dictators. How is that possible that none of these reformists, none of these young leaders who are inspiring a lot of people on the continent, how is it possible that they're not able to take up the leadership of the African Union, but somehow these dictators find a way of becoming the leaders or the chairman of the African Union?
It really depends first and foremost what you mean by dictators, Paul, because let's face it, those same individuals that you are characterizing as dictators, they will actually tell you that they were elected by their own people. And if they were elected by their own people, it would almost really be politically treasonous to describe them as dictators. What I can say frankly, and in fairness to all of them, I probably would say that most of those that have recently occupied that position come from countries that are democratically challenged.
Very interesting, because the reason I mentioned or said the word dictators, you look at, if you go back like 5 years ago, it's been the same thing. Robert Mugabe handed over to Idris Deby hands over to Paul Kagame hands over to Alpha Sisi. Eh?
Yeah, but when you think about it, there are 24 countries, for example, that are member states of the African Union.
24 or 54?
54 rather.
Yeah.
I stand corrected. There are 54 countries, and if you add Western Sahara, they become 55. But if you look at the elections that have been taking place on the continent historically, you will probably be very, very, very hard up. It will be very, very difficult, Paul, if not impossible, for you to actually come up with at least 15 countries that have conducted elections that would be characterized as being free, fair, credible, and whose results are verifiable. In other words, there are very, very few countries that form the African Union that would actually meet what someone will characterize as a democratic international threshold. And so it's not an accident, sincerely, that most of the people who end up occupying that position of chairman, again, tend to come from countries which are democratically challenged.
Is that the kind of leadership that Africans aspire to or look up to, should look up to?
Well, I would say that that shouldn't be the sort of leadership, frankly, that Africans should look up to, or that Africans, in fact, should expect, nor that, those are the type of leaders, frankly, that Africa should live with. I think that it is a very high time that we get more Senegal, when you talk about Senegal, you are almost talking about the beacon of African democracy, the beacon of hope for African democracy. You talk about South Africa. We need countries, more countries like Benin. We need more countries like Botswana, like Mauritius, like the Seychelles, like Ghana, and in fact, like the Nigeria of 5 years ago. And I hope that they could actually repeat that, because they actually have an opportunity to do that. So we need more countries, sincerely, that go through a democratic process and conduct elections whose, for example, results reflect the will of their people. Not elections, some call them selections, that essentially reflect really the interests or the concerns of the individuals that count the vote, or the guy that at the end of the day actually announces the results.
Before we go to counting the votes, I want us to talk just briefly about whether the African Union is a relevant body. When you look at the challenges the continent has, are really these leaders going there to address some of these challenges, or it's just more of the boys' club hanging out and having a good time?
I think that in fairness to the institution, ideally it is a great institution. And ideally, again, as I say, ideally, I emphasize that it means that it should really be an institution that delivers for the African people. The question is, when you actually become politically realistic, at the end of the day, I think some of those political doubting Thomases and what have you probably have a point. It almost ends up actually being a club of leaders or rulers who come from countries which, again, are democratically challenged. But you see, initially, the founding fathers, and we are talking about people like the Osajefo, for example, the kid from Nkrofo in Ghana. We're talking about Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. We're talking about people like Sekou Touré of Guinea-Conakry. We're talking about people like Modibo Keita of Mali. We're talking about people like Gamar, Colonel Gamar, Gamar Abdel Nasser. We're talking about those type of people. We're talking about people like Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere of Tanzania. We are talking about, to a certain degree also, perhaps the only man remaining alive among those people, the founding president of Zambia, Dr. Kenneth David Kaunda. These people had actually very, very good and noble ideas. They had actually wanted to see a United States of Africa. Kwame Nkrumah had studied in the United States for the most part, and had actually been inspired by the manner in which these United States of America were formed. And when, for example, his country became the first black African country to regain its political independence from Britain on March 6, 1957, he had actually offered Ghana, which had been, as a colony, the Gold Coast. He had offered Ghana to be a sort of nucleus, so that all these other subsequent countries which would regain their political independence would join Ghana, just like the original 13 states here in the United States, to form what he saw as a United States of Africa. The compromise eventually was the Organization of African Unity. And the OAU, whether you like it or not, it did a great job. It first of all accomplished its mandate, which was, for example, to decolonize Africa from the European powers. It also, when you think about it, in 1994, when South Africa held an election in which all the members of that community participated, and eventually you get a Madiba, Nelson Mandela, as the president, that was the end of apartheid. And that was under the Organization of African Unity. Now the question is, at the time you had, for example, the mandate of the OAU, which was non-interference in the internal affairs of member states. The AU says non-indifference, but in practice, it's pretty much almost all the same.
So it's just about semantics here.
Semantics, you got it.
Speaking of elections, elections are coming up over the weekend in Nigeria. Of course, there are several candidates, but two major candidates stand out, the incumbent Muhammadu Buhari and Atiku Abubakar. Those are the primary challengers. They are going neck to neck. Your thoughts in what do we expect in Nigeria?
It is very interesting that the two important candidates that you mentioned, both in terms of geography, as far as Nigeria is concerned, they both come from the northern part of Nigeria.
Absolutely.
Some would refer to them as people who perhaps come from or reflect what some critics, observers sometimes refer to as the Kaduna Mafia. They both come from northern Nigeria. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether Nigerians at the end of the day are feeling very comfortable with the manner in which Major General Muhammadu Buhari has been conducting affairs, in which case they can renew his lease in Aso Rock. The beautiful Aso Rock, by the way, I've been there, it's an incredibly beautiful place.
Nice, yeah.
Whether they can renew his lease there for another 4 years, or whether they would be interested in having someone new. And especially when you talk about Atiku Abubakar, he's not somebody that they don't know anything about. On the contrary, they know a lot of things about him, including, of course, the fact that he was vice president under the administration of General Olusegun Obasanjo.
By the way, I should add that until recently, Atiku Abubakar was not allowed to come to the United States because of the impending corruption charges against him. But that said, Buhari is running on the premise of fighting corruption, fighting the terrorism group Boko Haram, while his main challenger, Atiku Abubakar, is running on, his mantra is sort of like make Nigeria great again. Trying to say that as a business person, he can take Nigeria to the next level. Your thoughts?
You know, it is very interesting that you say that until recently that Atiku Abubakar was not allowed to come to the United States. But you know as well as I do that he was actually around a couple of weeks ago breathing the air right here.
True.
He also happens to be a legitimate owner of an incredibly beautiful mansion in Potomac, in Maryland. Yeah, there are those types of problems and perceptions and what have you, which he may probably have to overcome in order to be able to become the next occupant of Aso Rock. Because when you think about the fact that President Buhari seems to have been fairly successful, at least, in terms of fighting corruption.
His critics say he has not done a single thing.
Well, I have said
Nigerians are still very corrupt.
There are other sources that claim that he seems to have been fairly, successful in the sense that he has exposed the issue. He has brought the issue essentially on the table. It is something that needs to be addressed. He also initially had said that they had, in a sense, technically succeeded in the fight against Boko Haram, but it looks like the facts are totally different. He also obviously has a problem of, at some point last year, having spent several months in the United Kingdom, when he was receiving medical treatment and other kind of stuff. So there are some people who think that probably he may not really be as strong as he should be, but others say, no, he actually is. He's very good, he means very well, and he's the type of person that is incorruptible. Even though supporters of Atiku Abubakar don't think that he's that very much different from the other average Nigerian elite.
Mm-hmm. Any predictions in Nigeria?
I would say that I am not a prophet, and therefore I don't think that I would want to be in the business really of predicting who, as to who might, in fact, at the end of the day, be the occupant of Asorok. But it looks like if everything that I have seen remains pretty much the same, it looks like it may very well be a Muhammadu Buhari again having the opportunity for his political lease to be renewed so that he can stay another 4 years in Abuja.
Well, you are watching Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you live every Tuesday. Today we are talking about politics in Africa. Right now we are talking about the politics in Nigeria. But let's go to comments, Shaka. This is an interesting comment. It's going after you personally. They say whenever you talk about Uganda, you talk about it in a negative way. So let's go to a comment from Ni lately. Straight Talk Africa is an anti-Museveni and serving white interest. We need to discuss the issue of Africa, the African way. What do you say to that, Shaka?
First of all, I don't frankly think that I need to honor that kind of criticism sincerely, because I don't know where he gets those facts from. There's no question that just like any other person, any other member of the audience that listens and watches Straight Talk Africa is entitled to his opinion. But I doubt that he is entitled to his different sets of facts. The facts will show that Straight Talk Africa is a respectable program, weekly program that attempts to address issues that are very pertinent to most Africans. And we should also, by the way, make the difference of the Africans on the one hand and those who are in positions of power in Africa on the other. It sometimes feels like Africa is not a continent that has countries, and these countries have people who are citizens, who have equal shares in the affairs, in the policies that affect them in their countries. It looks like some of these countries sometimes tend to be seen as reflected in the individual who occupies State House at that time. When we think about Yoweri Museveni, I think it is very legitimate that we should be able to discuss President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, because our role as journalists here really at the Voice of America, and indeed all over the world, and in particular Straight Talk Africa, is to make public officials, including presidents, accountable. I remember, by the way, on a personal note, 2 years ago, when I went to participate in what was supposed to be presidential debate, and Yoweri Museveni, the president of Uganda, decided that he would not be very comfortable receiving questions coming from an individual journalist called Shaka Sali. And unfortunately, the organizers of that particular debate were able to compromise with him. And I came under incredible criticism from the audience because they expected me to make a difference. They expected me to make Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni accountable for his actions over the last more than 30 years that he has occupied State House in Entebbe and State Lounge in, Nakasero. And I was forced to tell them that what I was part of in the Ugandan capital, Kampala, was not a special edition of Straight Talk Africa. I had been invited, and therefore I had to operate under different ground rules which had put in place by somebody. But let's face it, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni is a very important person, a very important player. He is a man, for example, in the 1990s, who was among those few who were characterized by the Bill Clinton administration as a new breed of African leaders who were expected to be the beacons of hope for African democracy. As a matter of fact, I remember in 1997, I was one of those few journalists at State Lounge, Nakasero, when U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright made her first debut official trip to Uganda. She eventually went on to Rwanda, she went on to the Democratic Republic of Congo, she had been to Ethiopia, to Eritrea, and what have you. I remember when she was standing next to Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, she pointed at him and said, "You are the beacon of African democracy." In fairness to Madeleine Albright, and in fairness to Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, where is that democracy?
Just a quick follow-up from Emmanuel. He says, is it personal between you and President Yoweri Museveni?
On the contrary, as a matter of fact, Yoweri Museveni and my father, the late John Wilson Mushakamba, used to be political buddies. My own uncle, James Karambuzi, was one among the first people in 1973, if I remember correctly, to be publicly executed by Field Marshal General Idi Amin Dada, the man that used to refer to himself as the conqueror of the British Empire. And the reason Mr. Karambuzi was publicly executed is because he was actually apprehended, or he was found by the Ugandan security forces at the time with weapons belonging to a rebel leader called Yoweri Museveni. So I really don't have any personal issues with Museveni. We should be family, basically. All I have is the problems about the manner in which he goes about governing the country. And it is not because I don't like the way he governs, what have you, as an individual. No. Whatever I say is a reflection of the voices that come out of Uganda. This is a man who came to power back in 1986, a man that was so much loved because he seemed to press the right buttons. He seemed to say the right thing. But unfortunately, with time, there are people who think he has fundamentally changed. But you know, I am reminded by the words, the basically wise words of Michelle Obama, a former United States First Lady, Mrs. Barack Obama, who once said some time back that becoming a president does not change you, it reveals you.
Let's move along. Let's go to another comment from Michael. The question remains, why is Africa not allowed to implement the pre-colonial state that was peaceful and acceptable to us? I know you will not answer my question, but anyway, what your take, Shaka?
When you talk about Africa is not allowed, who is that person who is that institution, or who are those institutions which are preventing Africa from doing what he's asking about. Because at the end of the day, to be honest with you, I believe very, very strongly in the dignity, the integrity, and the pride of African sons, daughters. And I believe that it is up to the African youth, to be very honest with you, in a sense, to reincarnate that important African pride. And I have very, very strong belief that with these changing demographics, eventually you're going to have the vast majority of the population in Africa very, very young.
Are you referring like to people power or something like that?
Well, those are tactics, but the fact that you have a population that is not invested in the status quo and probably thinks that what is happening around them and what have you is not something that is very comfortable to live with, the circumstances will force these young people to come up with a sort of paradigm shift, to change things so that things can begin working for themselves. Because let's face it, Africa is not a poor continent. On the contrary, it probably is the most gifted part of planet Earth. We have all the minerals that we need to be a superpower. We have actually been preoccupied and in the business of helping other countries to become superpowers. I remember that Brother Walter Radney from Guyana, he wrote a book when he was teaching at University College Dar es Salaam, which was part of the University of East Africa at the time, alongside Makerere College, your alma mater, University College Nairobi, and all that kind of stuff. He wrote a classic book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. You know what? Actually, I think he could even have changed the narrative. He could even, in fact, have said how Africa developed Europe.
Interesting. What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we are basically looking at the upcoming presidential and general elections in Africa's most populous nation, the land of the ogres, the ogre pata pata, Nigeria.
Interesting. We still have time for maybe one comment. Real quickly from Mohammed, how can African countries work together to significantly get rid of insecurity and poverty?
First of all, they need to sincerely remove these superficial, artificial borders and boundaries which were put in place in 1984-85 during the Berlin Conference by Prince Bismarck. They need to do that. They also need to adopt a style of governance that allows, for example, the potentials of the Africans to be unleashed. Democracy, justice, and fairness. Because those values are not white. Those values are universal.
Well, on that note, it's been great having you here in studio. I look forward to hosting you on another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, so long from Washington. Thank you.